Hi, and welcome to Creepy Crime Story, where the darkest truths aren't imagined. They're real. When the dispatcher picked up the 911 call from a quiet home in the Hollywood Hills, they didn't expect to hear a woman screaming for her life. But that call, short, breathless, and broken, would ignite one of the most high-profile murder investigations Los Angeles had seen in years. The time was 1:16 a.m., February 15th, 2020. Within minutes, paramedics and LAPD units were on the scene. What they found was not a burglary, not a domestic dispute, not an accident. What they found was a crime scene with layers too precise to be impulsive, too violent to be ignored, and too familiar to those who had studied premeditated murder. The victim was Amie Harwick, a 38-year-old licensed marriage and family therapist. Her body was located in the courtyard below her third-floor balcony, covered in blunt force trauma, consistent with a fall from a height of approximately 20 feet. She was unresponsive, pulseless. Paramedics attempted resuscitation for 8 minutes before pronouncing her dead at 1:24 a.m. Inside the residence, there was no clear sign of forced entry at the front. However, the rear patio doors showed signs of tampering. The latch was disabled, and a pane of glass near the lower corner bore hairline fractures, consistent with the application of a pry tool. The sliding screen was misaligned, suggesting it had been hastily removed or knocked aside. More significant were the items found near the point of entry. Crime scene techs cataloged a hypodermic syringe, unused but loaded with a dark amber fluid, placed beneath the edge of a throw rug. Adjacent to it, on the floor near the kitchen counter, a small drawstring bag containing a medical-grade rubber tourniquet, latex gloves, and a second-cap syringe. Initial findings suggested that the victim may have attempted to flee or struggle with her attacker. A lamp had been overturned in the living room, and one of the sofa cushions had blood transfer patterns. Low velocity, consistent with surface contact, not high-impact spray. It appeared the conflict began inside and ended outside. Detectives secured the premises and initiated immediate background profiling. Harwick lived alone but had a roommate who occasionally stayed overnight. That roommate had not been present that night, returning only after Amie had gone out for an evening event. She made the 911 call after hearing what she described as a scream, a crash, and then silence. The call log showed two separate timestamps, first at 1:16 a.m., then again at 1:20 a.m., when she was asked to step outside for her own safety while responders approached. She told officers on scene that Amie had recently expressed unease about someone from her past resurfacing. This wasn't the first time Amie Harwick had felt unsafe in her own home. The scene was processed in phases. Forensics focused first on the interior disturbance, then on the trajectory of the fall. The balcony rail was intact. No signs of breakage. A smudge print, partial, was retrieved from the top rail. Right hand, unknown match. Later, this would become a key focal point in reconstructing the sequence of physical confrontation. A preliminary autopsy was requested within 12 hours due to media attention and the high-profile nature of the victim. Results revealed fractures in the pelvis, spine, and skull. But what changed the direction of the investigation entirely came from the forensic pathologist's note. There were signs of manual strangulation prior to the fall, petechial hemorrhaging, laryngeal bruising, and contusions on both sides of the neck, consistent with bilateral pressure. This was not a suicide. It was not a tragic misstep on a balcony. This was a homicide. Over the next 24 hours, surveillance canvassing began. Detectives pulled camera footage from nearby homes and traffic intersections. One residential unit, directly east of Harwick's property line, had a working night vision camera facing the rear alley. Footage showed a shadowed figure scaling a wrought iron gate shortly after 12:45 a.m., entering the rear yard of Harwick's home. No face, no defining marks, just a profile. Tall, lean. The subject stayed in frame for 11 seconds, then vanished behind a hedge. Evidence began stacking, not in chaos, but in clean lines, almost too clean. That was a concern to one of the lead detectives, who later remarked, "The data aligned too cleanly. Sometimes that's the problem." They didn't yet have a suspect, but the methodical approach, the knowledge of the property's layout, and the presence of a specific chemical agent suggested premeditation. Whoever came into that house didn't come for a robbery. They came for the woman. Further investigation uncovered no signs of theft. Amie's purse, laptop, watch, and prescription pad were untouched. Her front door was locked from the inside. Her dog, an aging spaniel mix, was confined to a gated area in the hallway and hadn't been harmed. There was no ransom note, no attempt to conceal the body, no cover-up. This wasn't a case of panic. This was a statement. Detectives began to build a victimology profile. Amie Harwick was not someone without enemies, but her public life painted a very different picture. She was active in women's rights organizations, spoke frequently about emotional abuse, and had recently contributed to a podcast discussing the psychological traits of obsessive ex-partners. That episode had aired 2 weeks before her death. Friends and colleagues described her as confident, hyper-aware of personal safety, and very private. One colleague told police she had recently mentioned someone she hoped never to see again. She hadn't named him, that someone, it seemed, might have found her first. In homicide work, the victim's past is never background, it's context. On paper, Amie Harwick had no open disputes, no recent threats, no pending legal actions. But within 36 hours of her death, detectives uncovered documentation that reframed the case. She was born in Sellersville, Pennsylvania in 1981. No criminal record, no mental health flags, no known substance use. Graduated with a master's in clinical psychology, later earning a PhD from the Institute for Advanced Study of Human Sexuality in San Francisco. She relocated to Los Angeles in 2009, establishing a private therapy practice in West Hollywood, primarily serving adult women recovering from trauma. Her clientele included high-profile names from the entertainment industry, many of whom requested anonymity even in death. By all professional metrics, she was accomplished. But homicide investigations don't rely on career highlights. They rely on pattern, proximity, and risk exposure. On February 16, 2020, the LAPD Violent Crimes Unit subpoenaed Amie's phone records and began canvassing her professional associates. What surfaced wasn't recent, but it was relevant. In 2011 and again in 2012, Amie had filed 2 temporary restraining orders against the same individual. Both orders were tied to stalking allegations, citing persistent unwanted contact, surveillance, and threats of harm. The first TRO was approved and lasted 6 months. The second expired without renewal. The name on both orders was redacted in the initial release to media. Internally, however, it triggered a flag note within California's criminal protection order system. That individual had no felony convictions, but prior law enforcement contact for disorderly conduct and domestic disturbance. Digital forensic analysts retrieved text backups from Amie's iCloud, including one conversation dated January 23, 2020. She had messaged a close friend shortly after attending an adult industry award show in Los Angeles. In the text, she wrote, "He was there, same eyes, same stare. He recognized me before I even saw him. I got out fast." There was no attached name, but the show's credential list included a freelance event photographer who had formerly been linked to her in social media images from 2011. Metadata confirmed he was present at the same venue that night. A match was under review by midweek. Meanwhile, forensic processing of Amie's laptop revealed she had visited a personal safety forum 3 days before her death. Searching, restraining order California expired, and can you reinstate after 10 years? No email draft or formal report had been composed. That line of inquiry, search intent without action, is common in victims of harassment. The hesitancy is often mistaken as inaction. But as one victim advocate told detectives off record, she knew the risk. She just didn't think he'd act this fast. Investigators turned to therapy logs and appointment records. HIPAA laws restricted full access, but her clinical billing system listed one session, marked private and off calendar, entered manually 2 weeks prior to the homicide. It was scheduled under an alias not linked to any prior patient. The session was canceled within an hour of its slot. There was no call record from that individual. On her office whiteboard, later removed as evidence, Amie had written a single phrase in red dry erase marker: "Be ahead of the pattern." Detectives reviewed her building's keycard logs and entry timestamps. No unauthorized access had been logged in the weeks leading up to the murder, but a technician from her home automation provider later confirmed that her outdoor motion light system, normally scheduled for 10 p.m. to 6 a.m., had been manually disabled at 12:18 a.m. on the night of her death via the back-end control panel. The command had not been issued from her device. That suggested access by someone who either understood the home's automation system or had physical access to the residence prior to the attack. There was no sign of hacking. The panel was connected via local Wi-Fi with no external bridge. In forensics, this is called a confidence indicator. It refers to behaviors that reflect a subject's comfort within an environment they shouldn't be comfortable in. Disabling lights, bypassing camera angles, entering without noise, all suggest prior familiarity. And familiarity in most homicides leads directly back to the victim's known associates. The physical timeline was solidifying. 12:18 a.m. Lights manually disabled. 12:45 a.m. Unknown male captured briefly on rear camera crossing alley fence. 1:16 a.m. 911 call placed by roommate. 1:24 a.m. Amie Harwick pronounced deceased. The psychological timeline, though, was older. It spanned a decade, threaded through repeated cycles of fear, retreat, and false reassurance. By 10:01 a.m. on February 16, 2020, the forensic lead assigned to the case, Dr. Manuel Ortiz, returned to the Mulholland Drive property with a focused objective: confirm whether the fatal fall was incidental or the end stage of a deliberate sequence. That morning's directive from the lieutenant was simple: process the balcony. The victim's third-floor unit overlooked a narrow courtyard surrounded by stucco walls and mature hedges. The balcony itself was framed by a wrought iron railing, standard height, structurally intact. No part of it was loose, bent, or compromised. There was no evidence of a breakthrough or structural failure. LAPD Forensic Services Division began a full sweep. Photographs, laser scan mapping, and chemical reagent testing were conducted on site. Two areas were immediately flagged. First, a horizontal handprint smudge, distinctly right-handed, was located on the top rail, 42 inches from the sliding door. Second, a heel print, men's size 11, was found near the outer edge of the balcony flooring. The print was consistent with movement away from the door, not toward it. This detail was crucial. The trajectory and positioning indicated the assailant had physically moved Amie Harwick onto the balcony under resistance. There was no evidence she had stepped out willingly. That conclusion was further supported by partial abrasion patterns on her forearms identified during autopsy, consistent with blunt contact against a textured surface, likely the exterior wall or the railing posts. Investigators noted trace residue on the upper rail, skin oil, particulate dirt, and what later tested positive for a petroleum-based pomade, commonly used in men's hair products. A small transfer mark, circular and matte, was also found 15 inches from the smudge. This was eventually matched to the rubber nose padding of eyewear, a pair of sports-style glasses possibly worn during the struggle. No fingerprints were viable. The smudge lacked ridges, but the physical evidence made one thing clear: the victim did not jump. She was forced over the edge during a struggle, and based on body positioning and post-mortem trauma sequencing, she was alive but unconscious at the time of the fall. This conclusion was corroborated by the coroner's preliminary report, issued that same day. The medical examiner had identified signs of ante-mortem neck compression, bruising to the larynx, hyoid bone stress, and subcutaneous bleeding inconsistent with post-fall trauma. Amie Harwick had been manually strangled before being thrown or dropped from the third-floor balcony. On the ground below, crime scene techs found a small silver earring, broken at the clasp. It matched one still attached to the victim's left ear. Nearby, in the planter bed, a narrow trail of disturbed soil led toward a side gate. The gate was unlatched and the motion sensor installed on it, normally connected to the home's central alarm system, had been disconnected. Wires were cut cleanly with a precision blade. Dr. Ortiz made the decision to widen the perimeter. Surveillance teams were instructed to re-canvass properties adjacent to Harwick's residence. One neighbor, located directly behind her home, shared night vision footage from a Nest camera aimed toward the alley fence. At 12:45 a.m., the feed showed a male figure scaling the 6-foot gate, landing in Amie's rear garden, then moving low along the wall. The video lacked audio and facial clarity, but the subject's behavior was calculated. No hesitation, no flashlight, no stumbling. The attacker hadn't wandered into the property, he had targeted it. He had known the layout, the blind spots, the weak entry points. That kind of precision wasn't random. It was operational. As Date Ortiz reviewed the physical layout with the forensics team, he noted the absence of shoe impressions on the balcony itself, aside from the single heel mark. There was, however, scuffing along the outer concrete edge. Lab technicians would later determine the scuff pattern matched the tread of a common climbing shoe. Sticky rubber sole, low arch compression. That added an entirely new consideration. The assailant may have ascended the building from the outside. This theory was tested the next day. A vertical access specialist from the LAPD Tactical Training Unit was brought in to simulate a third-floor climb using minimal equipment. With gloves, rubber-soled shoes, and a static cord, the ascent took just under 4 minutes. Using architectural elements, side gutters, window ledges, and the iron railing as leverage, the climb was possible, difficult but not impossible, especially for someone who had practiced. Back at the lab, swabs collected from the outer drain pipe yielded partial DNA. Not a full profile, but it was male, and not a match to any known associate of the victim. Inside the residence, nothing was stolen. Electronics were untouched. Jewelry was in place. Amie's phone was on the bed, unlocked, with one final note written the day before. An unsent text to a friend that read, "He's not over it." Her calendar was marked with a single word under Valentine's Day, work. There were no signs of a romantic dinner, no cards, no plans, just a normal entry. But nothing about what happened that night was normal. By the third day of the investigation, LAPD Major Crimes was no longer searching for what had happened. That part was settled, homicide by manual strangulation, followed by a deliberate fall from a third-floor balcony. What remained was who had the means, access, and motive. The suspect pool was never large, but now the scope narrowed sharply. Detectives began consolidating all digital logs, Wi-Fi router access history, smart home system logins, and synced mobile device records from the victim's account. At 2:04 a.m. on February 15th, 40 minutes after the time of death, Amie Harwick's home security system briefly attempted to reconnect to its cloud server. The request failed, but the attempt originated from a device that was not her phone, nor her laptop. It was a Samsung mobile unit with a MAC address unregistered to any known household devices. This point mattered because Amie exclusively used Apple products. She also had two-factor authentication active on all accounts. Whoever used that Samsung phone had either previously been granted access or had bypassed the system locally. There was no breach of her online credentials through remote entry. This was a physical access issue, not a cyber attack. Investigators subpoenaed AT&T tower logs in a 5-mile radius around the crime scene, targeting the 12 a.m. to 2:30 a.m. window. Over 400 unique device pings were registered. The Digital Analysis Response Team cross-referenced those pings against known traffic patterns, removed through movement data, and isolated 3 anomalous devices that lingered near the residence without connecting to Wi-Fi or traveling on nearby roads. One device ID matched the Samsung that had pinged the home system. That device was traced to a phone plan registered under an LLC, non-commercial, non-retail. The LLC had one named employee, a freelance photographer with expired press credentials, previously accredited for adult industry award shows in Los Angeles. Cross-checking venue rosters from the XBI's awards in January 2020 confirmed that the suspect had indeed been present, working media access. Eyewitness statements from that night, including one submitted by Amie's former colleague, described a tense encounter in the lobby between Harwick and a man with a camera, mid-30s, angry demeanor. There was no physical confrontation at the event and no police report filed. But the connection had reemerged, nearly 8 years after the last restraining order had expired. Surveillance units placed the LLC subject under passive watch. Detectives meanwhile returned to Harwick's known social connections. Her roommate had mentioned Amie was always careful about who she let back in, especially after years of managing clientele who had experienced intimate partner violence. She maintained minimal public exposure, used pseudonyms for online consultations, and avoided sharing her location in real time. But digital forensics revealed a lapse. In December 2019, Amie had made a Venmo payment with public visibility enabled. The recipient, a mutual friend once connected to the suspect. The note attached was harmless. Coffee, but it confirmed that Harwick's private circles still had indirect ties to individuals outside her current boundaries. No law was broken, but to a determined stalker, even passive data leaves a trail. Investigators then reviewed phone tower data from earlier in the week, February 11 to 14. The same Samsung device pinged within 300 feet of the Harwick property 3 nights in a row between 11 p.m. and 2:09 a.m. On February 14th, the night of the murder, it appeared twice, once at 12:16 a.m., then again at 2:04 a.m. after the homicide. LAPD analysts requested a forensic warrant for location history tied to the device. GPS data showed stationary positioning near the northwest side of Harwick's property for 38 minutes, between 12:32 a.m. and 1:10 a.m. That timing placed the suspect at the rear gate shortly before the balcony struggle and fall. Meanwhile, a background check on the LLC employee revealed prior misdemeanor arrests for trespassing and disorderly conduct in 2011 and 2013. No convictions, no outstanding warrants, but enough to establish behavioral precedents, especially in proximity to the victim's documented restraining orders. There was no direct evidence, yet, that he had been inside the property, but detectives now had a digital trail, a timeline match, a motive rooted in fixation, and a reappearance after years of no contact. They also had a lingering question. If this was personal, why the use of a syringe? Toxicology results returned from the lab on February 18th. The substance in the syringe was liquid nicotine concentrate. Dosage, 72 ml. Fatal if injected intravenously. Legal to purchase online. Rarely used in homicide. The presence of nicotine, gloves, and medical equipment suggested premeditation and preparation. The suspect had worked briefly as a tech in a clinical lab from 2009 to 2010. He was dismissed for insubordination. Personnel records showed he had access to medical storage areas and toxicology equipment. Detectives now had enough to formally identify him as a person of interest. On February 19, 2020, LAPD executed a sealed warrant for his residence. The search was scheduled for 4:00 a.m., exactly 1 week after Harwick's death. At 4:07 a.m. on February 19, 2020, LAPD executed a no-knock warrant at a 2-story apartment unit in Playa del Rey. The target was inside, asleep, alone. Entry was clean, no resistance. The suspect was detained without incident and transported to a holding facility for questioning. But the arrest wasn't the story that morning. The apartment was. Search teams moved quickly. The living space was minimal, stripped of decor, no television, no visible signs of hobbies. But the workspace told a different story. On a metal desk beneath the window, a disassembled Nikon DSLR sat next to a pair of used latex gloves and an external hard drive. The gloves were immediately bagged for DNA testing. The drive was imaged on site, contents encrypted. Investigators flagged it for expedited forensic analysis. Inside a utility drawer, they found a field notebook. The pages were lined with handwritten dates, addresses, and directional sketches, many matching intersections near Mulholland Drive. Several entries referenced perimeter gaps, light schedule, and vehicle entry 1 to 3 a.m. It wasn't a journal. It was operational planning. In the closet, a coil of black paracord, carabiners, and climbing shoes. Size 11, Vibram sole. A match and tread design to the scuff pattern on Harwick's balcony ledge. There was no climbing harness, suggesting the user had trained freehand. Investigators found residue from a magnesium chalk compound on both soles. Trace comparison later confirmed it was chemically identical to the sample lifted from the balcony rail. The bathroom yielded 2 items of interest. First, a travel-sized bottle of nicotine concentrate, labeled 72 ml, partially used. Second, a biohazard disposal pouch tucked beneath the sink containing a single-cap syringe and a strip of medical tape. The label on the tape matched the adhesive brand identified on the tourniquet found at Harwick's residence. Everything about the apartment, its layout, its silence, its contents, reinforced what detectives had already feared. The crime had not been impulsive. It was engineered. The suspect was interviewed that same morning. He declined legal counsel but offered no substantial answers. Statements were brief, often contradictory. He admitted attending the ex-BS event in January, but denied approaching the victim. When asked about his proximity to her home the night of her death, he stated, "I went for a walk. No direct admission, no narrative, just distance." Meanwhile, lab teams prioritized the fingerprint swabs from the balcony's outer edge. Ridge detail was limited, but a partial latent matched the suspect's right thumbprint at 74-point correlation. In combination with the heel print, chalk trace, and cell tower triangulation, the evidence was no longer circumstantial. It was layered, specific, weighted. The breakthrough came late in the day when analysts decrypted the contents of the hard drive. Among files labeled wedding, portrait, and press kit, a folder titled A 2020 contained over 30 surveillance images of Harwick's home. Most were taken at night, time-stamped. Some were shot through a long lens from a concealed angle, likely the alley behind the property. The earliest photo was dated January 17th. The latest was February 13th, 48 hours before her death. There was no doubt. He had watched her. He had planned. He had waited. The search team located a backpack under the bed containing cash, protein bars, and a prepaid cell phone. Its call log was empty, but location history showed it had pinged near the Harwick property 3 nights prior. The final entry, 1:28 a.m., February 15th. The court filing was immediate. Based on cumulative evidence, the district attorney's office moved forward with charges: murder with special circumstances, first-degree burglary, and lying in wait. The phrase isn't just legal terminology, it carries weight. In California law, lying in wait enhances the charge from ordinary homicide to a capital offense. It implies surveillance, entrapment, intent. Some investigators paused longer than others after that warrant closed, not because the job was done, but because of what it represented. She had tried to move on, tried to build something better, and someone had weaponized that hope against her. By the time formal charges were filed on February 20th, 2020, the case had already shifted from investigation to strategy. The physical evidence was in place. The digital trail was mapped. The suspect was in custody. But conviction in a courtroom doesn't depend solely on what was found. It hinges on how tightly the findings connect to intent and how clearly that intent can be demonstrated to a jury. Prosecutors from the Los Angeles County District Attorney's Office reviewed the compiled forensic timeline. The scene reconstruction, corroborated by time-stamped surveillance, cell tower triangulation, and recovered physical objects, was clean and sequential. There was no reasonable explanation for the suspect's presence at Harwick's residence except purposeful entry. No burglary, no robbery, no sign of financial motive. It was personal and deliberate. Trial preparation began with victimology, framing Amie Harwick not as a symbol, but as a professional with a documented pattern of targeted harassment. Her previous restraining orders filed in 2011 and 2012 were pulled from court archives. Though expired, the content of those orders, detailing threats, surveillance behavior, and physical intimidation, created a clear behavioral precedent. What mattered to the prosecution wasn't just that the suspect had been there. It was that he had been warned off, legally, years before. He had returned, uninvited, with knowledge of her routines and tools suited for access and silence. That made the case more than a murder. It made it a calculated act following a history of boundary violations. Witness coordination was critical. Friends, colleagues, and former clients of Harwick were interviewed again. Several recalled her mentioning past fear, though few had known details. One friend produced a screenshot of a message Amie had sent a month before her death. "He's resurfaced. I feel it. No contact yet, but something's off." The message hadn't named the suspect, but its timing aligned with his first verified appearance near her property in mid-January. Digital forensic analysts also extracted cache location data from a backup file on the suspect's external hard drive. Hidden folders revealed route simulations between his residence and Harwick's, with notes about traffic cameras, private drive access, and blind approach windows. Analysts confirmed the folder had been opened and modified within 24 hours of the homicide. A separate set of files labeled Egress detailed alternate exit strategies from the neighborhood, avoiding major intersections. One included a map with the word Plan B written in the corner. That evidence, while not graphic, was devastating in implication. It showed mindset. It showed control. And in a trial, mindset matters. Amie's therapist, granted limited testimony clearance, confirmed the victim had expressed concern about a former partner who didn't know how to let go. Though legally constrained from revealing patient detail, the therapist's affidavit supported a long-term pattern of unease, escalation, and psychological preparation for worst-case outcomes. The defense attempted early mitigation. Court filings suggested mental instability, citing a history of depressive episodes and possible dissociative behavior. No formal psychiatric diagnosis was submitted. No medical exemption was requested. The defendant remained mute through pretrial motions, speaking only to confirm name and representation. The judge allowed the trial to proceed with all forensic exhibits intact. No challenges were upheld regarding the evidence chain. Every item, gloves, climbing gear, nicotine concentrate, surveillance images, was deemed admissible. Outside the courtroom, the response from the professional psychology community was swift. Several associations issued joint statements, pushing for reforms around long-expired restraining orders and advocating for digital safety education among mental health providers. The conversation moved from individual tragedy to systemic gaps. How legal protections fade while behavioral patterns often don't. Amie's former clients began privately organizing outreach sessions, not to publicize the case, but to provide guidance on boundary setting and personal safety, especially for practitioners dealing with high-risk or obsessive individuals. Her name became more than an identifier in court records. It became part of a broader conversation about how protection needs to outlast obsession. Behind the procedural logic, there's always collateral: grief, disbelief, missed signs. That truth, while outside the chain of custody, never leaves the room, especially not for those who still have to testify. The trial of Gareth Pursehouse began on August 29, 2023, in Los Angeles County Superior Court. More than 3 years had passed since the murder of Amie Harwick. In that time, the forensic architecture of the case had remained intact, unshaken by defense motions, delays, or procedural technicalities. The state had built its case with discipline. Now it had to be delivered under scrutiny in open court. The prosecution opened with the timeline. It was methodical. The surveillance footage from January, the unauthorized device access on February 15th, the shoe print on the balcony, the DNA on the railing. Every detail was time-stamped, preserved, and admitted. The jury heard how each piece connected, not in isolation, but in escalation. Evidence was introduced in layers. First, the physical: gloves, the syringe kit, the nicotine vial. Then digital: phone tower data, hard drive contents, GPS movement logs. Forensic experts testified to chain of custody and testing methodology. No major objections were sustained. The court recognized the data as untainted, the result of standard investigative procedure. The phrase "lying in wait" was repeated frequently. Prosecutors emphasized that the crime did not begin on February 15th. It began weeks earlier, with surveillance, route planning, and preparation. When the jury saw the folder marked A2220 on screen, containing covert photos of Amie's home, there was no reaction in the gallery. But the weight of premeditation became evident. Witnesses were called in sequence. Harwick's roommate described the night of the murder, what she heard, how she found the back door open, and the scream before silence. Her voice was steady, but the courtroom remained still. No theatrics, just fact. Amie's colleagues gave context. They spoke about her professional routines, how cautious she had become after the encounter in January, and how she avoided discussing her private life. One testified that Amie had mentioned someone from her past making an unexpected reappearance, though she hadn't named him. A forensic pathologist reviewed the autopsy report. They explained the signs of strangulation, laryngeal bruising, subcutaneous hemorrhage, and confirmed that the injuries were sustained before the fall. The fall had caused multiple fractures, but it had not been the cause of death. Manual neck compression had occurred minutes earlier. Then came the climbing analysis. A training officer from LAPD demonstrated, through diagrams and measured photographs, how the killer could have ascended to the balcony using only physical leverage and local architectural features. The climbing shoes recovered from the suspect's apartment matched the scuff marks. Chalk residue confirmed it. The defense countered on two fronts: mental health and circumstantial exposure. They argued that Pursehouse had experienced emotional instability, possibly compounded by past trauma, and that his presence near Harwick's home could be explained by an accidental encounter or nostalgia. They challenged the inference of intent, but the strategy lacked technical footing. No psychologist testified. No medical history was introduced. The defendant declined to take the stand. Cross-examination of prosecution witnesses focused on narrowing perception, suggesting coincidence, not cause. But none of the witnesses deviated. Each confirmed what they had seen, heard, or handled. What struck courtroom observers was the defendant's demeanor. He remained seated, unspeaking, staring ahead. No notes, no reaction to evidence. If he had a strategy, it wasn't visible. Throughout the trial, the judge maintained a steady tone, measured, deliberate. The jury was composed of 8 women and 4 men. Most had no legal background. Several were educators, one a logistics manager, one retired. Jury selection had emphasized neutrality, not profile. As closing arguments approached, the prosecution summarized the case not as a spectacle, but as a structure. They didn't frame Amie Harwick as a martyr. They described her as a person who had taken all the right steps, reported threats, set boundaries, secured her home, and was still hunted. They asked the jury to consider not just what was done, but how it was done. The defense closed with a plea for doubt. They questioned whether obsession alone equaled intent, but the facts had already answered that. On September 28, 2023, inside the Los Angeles Superior Court, after 4 days of deliberation, the jury returned a unanimous verdict: guilty of murder in the death of Amie Harwick. Christopher Copley, the former boyfriend, was convicted on multiple counts: first-degree murder and first-degree burglary, with the special circumstance of lying in wait. The charge left no room for ambiguity. The evidence, the intent, the method, it all pointed to one outcome. The court imposed a life sentence without the possibility of parole. Throughout the proceedings, the prosecution built a case grounded in forensic data and digital footprints. Copley's movements were traced using geolocation from his mobile device, which placed him near Amie's apartment during the early hours of February 15, 2020. Surveillance footage had already captured his figure near the rear entrance of the building hours before the attack. DNA analysis later confirmed his presence in areas where he had no lawful reason to be. The prosecution emphasized the forcible entry, the deliberate disabling of lights, and his calculated return to the victim's life after years of separation. One of the most damning elements was the series of threatening text messages he had sent months prior. Short, sharp fragments of obsession and entitlement masked behind a facade of self-pity. That history, combined with his violation of a restraining order in 2012, helped establish a pattern of escalating behavior. The court didn't need to rely on emotional appeal. The evidence told a complete story. Amie had been found unresponsive, 40 feet below her third-story balcony. The medical examiner ruled her cause of death as blunt force trauma consistent with an intentional fall. But it was not the fall that raised the deepest alarms. It was what happened in the apartment beforehand. Signs of a violent struggle were clear: broken fingernails, defensive wounds, blood near the entryway. The autopsy supported what law enforcement had suspected. Amie had fought to survive. As the sentence was read, Copley stood still, jaw tight, eyes blank. No statement, no apology. His silence had long ceased to be mysterious. It had become just another form of control. In contrast, friends of Amie, including her former fiancé, Drew Carey, submitted statements honoring her legacy. Carey's written words, read aloud by a victim advocate, spoke not of their romance, but of her passion for helping others, her advocacy for domestic violence survivors, and her unwavering optimism despite past trauma. The public response to the verdict was swift and emotional, but also deeply analytical. Experts in domestic violence prevention, legal scholars, and members of the entertainment community pointed to Amie's death as a failure of the existing legal system to adequately protect victims of stalking and coercive control. Though Amie had once obtained a restraining order against Copley, and though she had reported feeling unsafe, no law had been able to prevent his final act of violence. In the months that followed the trial, lawmakers in California reintroduced legislative measures aimed at tightening the legal definitions of stalking, enhancing penalties for repeat offenders, and expanding victim protections. The bills gained traction with bipartisan support, pushed forward in part by the visibility of Amie's case and the pressure applied by public advocates. Her colleagues in the mental health field established the Dr. Amie Harwick Foundation, aimed at funding therapy for survivors of domestic abuse, particularly in underserved communities. In a quiet ceremony in February 2024, exactly 4 years after her death, a plaque was installed at a small community counseling center in East Hollywood, bearing the inscription, "She chose to heal others. Her voice remains." While the media coverage eventually faded, the discourse surrounding her death left a long-term impression on the cultural and legal landscape. It prompted uncomfortable questions about how society handles warning signs, how often we normalize obsessive behaviors until they turn fatal. Her murder was not random, it was preventable, and that is precisely what makes the loss feel sharper. From an investigative standpoint, the case was solved efficiently, but resolution in court does not equate to emotional closure. For those who knew her, and for the many who only came to know her through her death, Amie's story became a mirror held up to every failed protective order, every dismissed report, every system that still falls short. Her story now stands among a painful archive of women lost to men who once claimed to love them. Justice was served, but late, and it required death to move the needle. Sometimes justice arrives too late to save a life, but it's never too late to honor the truth. What happened to Amie reminds us that no degree, no success, no strength of character can fully shield someone from violence rooted in control. As someone who's watched too many stories end this way, I urge you, if something feels wrong, speak up. If someone you love is hurting, believe them. Protect them. We owe each other that much. What do you think still needs to change to truly protect victims before it's too late? Have you or someone you know faced a similar struggle with being believed or protected? Let me know in the comments. Your voice matters here. If this video moved you or even challenged you, drop a comment with your thoughts, or just share where you're watching from. And if you're new here, subscribe so you won't miss the next story that just might change how you see the world.